I'm a long-time flyer of fixed-wing and helicopters, and for the last 10 years or more I've been principally a Spektrum flyer, at least in terms of transmitter. The Spektrum-DX9 has been my principal transmitter. Yeah, I'm very happy with it, generally. The DX9 is a great transmitter. But I've acquired more and more things that I can't fly with the DX9. I can fly Spektrum DSM stuff, DSM to DSMX with it, and I've got adapters that allow me to fly SLT and FHSS with it. Anything beyond that I can't fly with it, so I've got to fly with it use some other transmitter. I recently acquired an OpenTX transmitter, the Jumper T16, which is now actually OpenTX. I've actually flashed it to OpenTX, though it's still only a nightly build at the moment because I'm making this video before a release has come out that fully supports the Jumper T16. Anyhow, that's another story. I wanted to set up helicopters of various sorts on the Jumper T16 using OpenTX, and I found it quite confusing doing so. There's quite a bit of information about, but it's a bit muddled and hard to find and put together. So I thought I've done what I can to put together information and get to the point where I feel reasonably competent and I know what I'm doing programming these various types of helicopters in OpenTX. So especially since it's now winter and I can't, pretty much, we've already got like 6 inches of snow outside. I can't really make outdoor videos very readily. I thought I'd make a little series of videos about how to program helicopters in OpenTX, and it is going to have to be a series of videos because it's a little more complex than can be sensibly handled in one video. It would just get too long. And this is the first video, and all I want to cover in this video is to introduce the different types of helicopters so I can then deal with them one by one in subsequent videos. So that's what this video is targeted at, is clarifying the differences between the different types of helicopters, specifically from the point of view of transmitter control, so we can then address those one by one and cover how to get them going in OpenTX. So I would say, well, there's certainly 2 very broad categories of helicopters, and since one of those subdivides again, essentially there's sort of 3 categories which are represented by these helicopters I've got here. This Gaui, this is a Gaui 200, represents pretty much where the modern RC helicopter story starts. Of course there's much bigger ones, but it's a helicopter with a flybar and without a flight controller. This is the receiver here. This is actually a Spektrum receiver. You've got your receiver, and the receiver channels are connected directly to the servos that drive the head, the cyclic servos. The first channel there is the throttle, which controls the ESC, which controls the primary motor, which drives both the rotors and the tail, since this is a tail that's driven via a torsion bar. Then you've got 3 channels which will drive, one each will drive a cyclic servo, and then you've got a channel, then you've got a tail servo here, which is fallen off, I see. That would be very bad to try and fly like that. That's supposed to be stuck to that foam pad. It needs a new foam pad. Obviously hasn't been flown for a little while. That's the tail servo, although it does allow us to see it a little bit better, but that's the tail servo, which controls that's the tail gyro, which controls the tail servo, which sets the pitch of the tail rotor to control the rotation of the tail. Now, the critical point here is that in this kind of helicopter, which is typical of your older helicopters, things like the Blade 400, the Blade 450, but is not at all typical of more modern helicopters by and large, certainly not the consumer ones, this does not have a flight controller. Pretty much all the newer helicopters, especially the smaller ones, tend to have interior flight controllers, which means that the individual transmitter-receiver channels are not directly controlling the head servos. But in these older helicopters, the receiver-transmitter channels are directly controlling the head servos, which means that corrective cyclic mixing has to be done in the transmitter. The transmitter has to create the necessary mixing between the two. You want to achieve a couple of things with the head. You want to tilt the head to the side or to backwards and forward to move the helicopter. You also want to raise the whole swash plate to increase or decrease the pitch of the blades, to pull the helicopter up sharply or push it down more. So those are two separate things that are being done by the head of a collective pitch helicopter, tilting and raising and lowering to change the pitch. And you have to achieve that by mixing in the transmitter for these older helicopters, because the transmitter channels are directly moving the arm of the cyclic servo up and down. So to get, for example, a higher positive pitch, you have to move all of the servos up. To go forward, you have to move the front servos down and the back servo up, and you have to be doing that via specific commands on each channel for each servo from the transmitter. Now, there is some help to do that. That's basically what the Heli page in OpenTX is for, is to help you set up, is to allow you to set up that what they call CCMP, cyclic collective mix programming. And we'll get to that when we deal with a video on how to program one of these helicopters. They do have a tail gyro. I'm not going to try and deal with helicopters that don't have gyros, since nobody really tries to fly helicopters without gyros anymore. And as I say, this one's actually come loose. It's supposed to be attached to a side by a foam pad there, so the foam pad dampens the vibration. This senses the yawing and basically helps to keep the tail where you want it, to stop the helicopter turning when you don't want it to turn. Tail gyros. The earliest tail gyros were just essentially what are called rate gyros. They just dampened the turning. They would sense a turn and counteract it to some degree so the turn was not sharp. Subsequently, you got heading hold gyros, which are what pretty much all gyros use now, have heading hold capability, which means they actually try and keep the helicopter pointing in a specific direction. They're not merely dampening movement. They're actually trying to keep, unless they receive a rudder command that tells the helicopter to turn, they're trying to keep the helicopter pointing in a specific direction. So typically modern gyros support both heading hold and rate modes, and there's a channel which goes, there are actually two wires here which go, I'm sorry, I should have taken the cover of this one off, but there are two connections that go from the transmitter to the gyro, one of which is the rudder command, which means I'm telling the helicopter to turn left, I'm telling the helicopter to turn right, and the other is a gyro control channel which sets the gyro gain, but basically adjusts the gyro gain. There's also a pot on here to set gyro gain, and then there's one wire that comes out of the gyro which controls the tail servo. So you've got typically two channels controlling the gyro, essentially the rudder channel which gives your commands to yaw, and a gyro gain channel. It's not possible to absolutely totally generalize about gyro gain channels, but it's probably the most common arrangement with a gyro gain channel is that positive values set heading hold gain and negative values set rate mode gain. So a value of plus 60 will basically set a 60% heading hold for gain, and a value of minus 60 will set a 60% rate gain. Gain means the volume of the gain means how strongly the gyro is trying to correct for movements. If you have too much gain, you tend to get a twitchy tail. If you have too little gain, the tail tends to drift and be mushy and to not stay where you want it to stay. So you need to adjust the gyro gain to get the result you want in terms of flying. But It's also further confused by the fact if you're used to Spektrum programming it, the Spektrum sets the gyro gain between 0 and 100 instead of between -100 and +100. So when you're programming on a Spektrum transmitter, a gyro gain of 50 actually means a gyro channel value of 0. But we're not going to Spektrum here anyway. But if you're coming from Spektrum, you've got to remember that and try not to get confused, because a Spektrum value of 60 would actually would be a very low heading hold gain. It would be a heading hold gain of 20% because it's 10% above the 50 middle, and you've got to double it. So a gyro value of 60 in a Spektrum transmitter would represent actually +20, which would mean 20% heading hold gain for most gyros. And it's not a value you would really normally use. You usually want a lot more than that. And values below 50 in Spektrum are actually rate mode, usually, because they're negative, they're below 0. So they create rate mode. So a Spektrum value of 20 would be 30% below 50, so that would represent 60% rate mode gain. I suppose I'm getting into too much detail here, really, again. But the point is, we will get into this again when we get into programming these, at least. And I'm not going to cover every detail of the programming anyway, but we'll cover at least the basics of the programming. The basic point of these type of helicopters, these older type of helicopters, mostly older, is that they do not have a flight controller board on the helicopter. They only have a gyro for the tail. Otherwise, the channels coming from the transmitter to the receiver are directly controlling the arm of the cyclic servo. Now, pretty much all more modern helicopters, pretty much I'm making this at the end of 2019, and virtually anything that came out since 2010 in the sort of consumer market, ready-made helicopters that you would buy, pretty much anything is going to have a flight controller of some sort in it. So this is an XK120, which is a relatively recent helicopter from XK, but I mean it's basically just very much an update. It's a slightly bigger version. They've got the K100, K110, K120, K130. This has a flight controller built into it. So when you send commands over a particular transmitter receiver channel to this, you are not directly setting the position of the head servo. You are just telling the flight controller, well, this is an integrated receiver flight, that's an ESC underneath, but this is the integrated flight controller and receiver. You're basically just telling the helicopter what you want it to do. So, for example, with the older type helicopter, if I give a command on a particular channel, it just raises this one servo. It directly controls the servo. Here, you've got no direct connection. There's no one-to-one mapping between channels and the servos. When you've got a flight controller like this, you're telling the helicopter, I want you to tilt forward, I want you to tilt sideways, and the flight controller figures out what to do with the servos to achieve that. So, likewise, you're telling the helicopter, generally with this one at least, you're telling the helicopter, I want you to increase the pitch of the blades, I want you to decrease the pitch of the blades, and again the flight controller figures out what commands need to be sent to the individual servos to do that. Now, the reason I said there are 3 types, and that's why, rather than just 2, i.e. those with a flight controller, without a flight controller, is that when you get to something like this, which is the WL Toys 977, there's infrared helicopter on it. That, of course, is nonsense. It is not an infrared helicopter. It's a 2.4 gigahertz radio-controlled helicopter, also known as the PowerStar X1. This is the WL Toys V977. Looks very similar to that. It is very similar in many ways. It has a flight controller. It has the ESC underneath. Has 3 servos in a 120 configuration. Both the the XK helicopter and the WL-TOIS helicopter are using motors to drive the tail rather than driving the tail by a torque tube off the main motor, as is the Gaui, and as is typical of the older helicopters, and of still of many bigger helicopters now. Although with flight controllers, even bigger helicopters, some of even the bigger helicopters are using motors in the tail rather than direct drive. But still, the really larger ones still use direct drive. That you use drive to the tail, but via a torque tube from the main motor rather than having a separate motor for the tail. The difference in these two have to be programmed fairly differently, because the XK helicopters, although they have a flight controller, give you direct control of the rotor pitch via a channel from the transmitter. So you've got a channel from a transmitter-receiver channel which tells the flight controller what pitch you want. Whereas with the WL-TOIS helicopters, and that pretty much applies to all of the WL-TOIS helicopters, including this is much bigger brother, the 950. The 950 is a collective pitch helicopter and has full, ability to fly in idle up mode and fly upside down and whatever. But it does not give you any way of controlling the pitch from the transmitter. The control of the pitch in idle up mode and the different way the pitch is handled in idle up mode between normal mode and idle up mode. Of course, in normal mode, the pitch usually starts slightly negative, and then basically normal mode you're always flying the right way up. So when you're in the air, you've always got positive pitch because you always need lift. So your typical pitch curve in normal mode goes from very slightly negative up into positive, whereas as soon as you switch to idle up mode, your motor is running fast all the time, pretty much, and your pitch curve goes from some degree of fully anyway, from an equal amount positive to an equal amount negative, generally. But in the case of the WL-TOIS helicopters, that handling of the pitch is built into the flight controller. When you switch the flight, you switch the flight controller from normal mode to idle up mode by giving it a command on a particular channel. You just set a particular channel, you change it from whatever, -100 to +100, and that tells the helicopter, the flight controller in the helicopter, switch from normal mode to idle up mode, and the helicopter automatically switches to the different throttle curves and throttle curve and pitch curve needed for idle up. Whereas this is not the case with the XK. With the XK, you handle that in the transmitter. You do not handle the collective cyclic mixing for the head in the transmitter, but you do handle the differential throttle and pitch curves that are needed for the idle up mode as against the normal mode. And a clue to this is to look at the manual. Now, the manual for the XK this XK120 is pretty rudimentary. That's the Chinese side of it. But if we look here, that's just a list of spare parts, but the critical page, if we can get it out, is this one. And if we look at this page, you can see that they give you pitch and these are throttle curves and pitch curves for normal and idle up. So this is the suggested throttle curve and pitch curve for normal mode, and this is the suggested throttle curve and pitch curve for idle up. I notice actually they're not suggesting changing the pitch curve between normal and idle up at all, but that's kind of unusual. I normally would change it. The fact that the manual gives you throttle and pitch curves is a dead giveaway that you're dealing with this type of helicopter. Assuming we know we're talking about a relatively modern helicopter with a flight controller. If there's throttle and pitch curves in the manual, obviously you can control the pitch, else there wouldn't be much point in them giving you that. They don't give you that in WL-TOIS because you do not have the ability to control the pitch in that. The pitch it is most typically controlled through channel 6. It's not absolutely fixed, but generally again, if possible, you try and look at the manual. If the manual doesn't tell you anything useful, you fish around on the internet or you try and guess. This manual, for example, this manual suggests you put 30% expo on channels 1 and 2. Now, what does that tell us? Well, basically what it tells us is that 1 and 2 are going to be the lateral and longitudinal cyclic channels, because they wouldn't be telling us to put expo on the throttle channel. Sometimes 1 is the throttle channel, sometimes with some helicopters, but clearly 1 is not the throttle channel on here, else they wouldn't be telling us to put expo on it. So the fact that they tell us in the manual to put 30% expo on channels 1 and 2 pretty much tells us that this uses channel 1. Almost certainly channel 1 is the lateral cyclic, channel 2 is longitudinal, which tilts the helicopter from side to side. Channel 2 is the longitudinal cyclic, tilting it back and forth. So channel 3 will be the throttle, which increases or lowers the power. Channel 4 will be the rudder for yawing the helicopter. Channel 5 will be gyro gain, which controls the gyro. Exactly what setting a value for gyro gain varies very much from one controller to a helicopter to another, so we have to figure that out a little bit. But channel 5 will be some sort of gyro or stabilization control channel, and channel 6 will be the pitch channel, which sets the pitch of the blades, and it may be that channels 7 and 8 are also used for some sort of purpose, usually for setting things like auto-stabilization or other kinds of features that are implemented in the flight controller. Well, I hope that's a little bit clear. I'm sorry if it gets a little bit complicated. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments. What I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to deal with the details of how to program. I'm going to do this type of helicopter first, I think, because this is the most common type of helicopter. Not specifically the K120, but a helicopter with a built-in flight controller, but which allows you direct control of the pitch. So you program your own pitch and throttle curves, but you have a flight controller for the cyclic collective mixing. That's the most common type of helicopter these days. So the next video I will cover in detail how to program a helicopter of this type in OpenTX. And then we'll move on to the other types of helicopters. This is actually really the simplest to program, since there's not much you can program really. But still, getting it right and making it fly properly isn't as straightforward as it might be. It's relatively straightforward, so long as you choose the right channels for things and whatever. So this is because you can't do much with this, because most of it's locked into the flight controller. This type is the simplest to program, and then this is basically the most complicated to program, and also the least likely to be what you're trying to program these days. So I will get into this, but I'll probably leave that to the last video in the series. Anyway, this has run too long already, probably, so I should finish up with it.